there was a black man and his wife and children lived on my granddaddy's farm. And they were great friends. As a matter of fact, my granddad grew up with the kids, my dad, I mean, grew up with kids from that family, which was a large family. And his best friend was Harold, was a great friend to my dad. And they just lived in each other's house back and forth and played together. And one day, Daddy and Harold, when they were just young guys, they climbed a persimmon tree and got the ripe persimmons. And when Harold got down, his hat was left up there in the tree. So my dad ran up and got the hat down. So by that time my grandfather came up, wanted to know who'd been up his persimmon tree. And Harold said, it was me, although my dad had been up there as well. And we visited Harold until my dad's death many years later. But anyway, what I started to tell you, talking about these fertilizer sacks, Shone was the elderly black man. He grew up without a mother and father, as did my grandfather, and they had been great friends and protectors of each other since the time of Civil War. And so Shone, I never saw him with any shoes on. He was always barefoot and bib overalls with only one strap to it. And one day he was out cutting wood, and somehow or another the axe slipped and he cut his foot. And so he called his wife, says, go get me some string off the fertilizer bag and a needle. So she went and brought him the string that was along the top of the fertilizer bags to hold it together. He threaded the big old needle and sewed his foot up, and never got sick, never got an infection, never got tetanus, never had a tetanus shot in his life. And so that's the kind of medical treatment that was available to a lot of black folks and many white people too. I never will forget, during the Depression, I don't know how my daddy did it, but my grandparents in South Carolina didn't have electricity, as I've said, so they didn't even have a radio. But he bought them a battery-operated radio. Well, the battery was about as big as the radio, and it was about it was bigger than a car battery. And then the radio was a table model, but it was a handful for one man. And I can remember by then we had an old 1936 Chevrolet, which we were stuck with until 1947. I can remember driving my dad to the bus station on Christmas Day, late Christmas Day, it's dark, and him hauling that radio to take to my grandparents. And of course they obviously were thrilled, but they had to conserve that battery because there wasn't a lot of cash money. When the battery went dead, they had to buy a new one. So they would ration their radio listening, and nobody listened to the radio until after supper, and then they would go in and listen to 30, 40 minutes of it, and even the neighbors would come in because none of the neighbors had a radio. And that radio was still sitting in their house when their house was sold years later. But at some point, my granddaddy decided he was going to put gas lighting in the house. And that was when he was a little flushed with his cotton money. So he built a little shack next door to it, and they piped gas to every room in the house to a little sconce type thing on the wall. And but by the time I was able to remember, they'd quit using it. And but those fixtures were still on the wall. And it was a very crude thing. They would take calcium carbide, which came in little flakes, and put it in a tank and pour water in it, and that formed carbide gas, I guess. And that's what they lit the house with for a short time. But somebody nearby blew themselves up and burned the house down with it. So my granddaddy went out and shut it off and never used it again. So that was the closest they ever came to having lighting through the house. But I can remember visiting there, and that was, sun went down, the kerosene lamps came out. And I thought it was kind of neat, you know, and my sister and I did. And when we got word that I was 5 years old when my grandfather died, and I can remember them calling us, and we got there. It was well after dark before we could get there. It was, I don't know, 150 miles away. And back during those days, that was a major trip. And we got there after dark, but all the neighbors had brought their lanterns in and had put them on the porch and out in the yard and throughout the house. And that was a shock to me. I'd never seen it lit up like that at night. And went inside, because there were a lot of people. My sister and I were sitting there, and funerals were not an expensive arrangement during those days, and there were an awful lot of wooden coffins used. But it so happened that my grandmother's brothers were in the furniture business, and when you were in the furniture business back in those days, you were also in the funeral business because of the caskets. So they had brought a casket out to the house. My grandfather was still there in the house. My sister and I were sitting there, and we were amazed that this man rolled in a half a barrel of bananas. And we just thought that was pure lavishness. I mean, we just thought that was the lap of luxury. But people, of course, brought in food and cakes and all kind of food. But things got quiet. And I asked my mom what was going on, where my daddy was. She said, he's busy. He'd be out in the living. They over in the parlor, they called it. And it was the custom for the sons to put their father in the casket. And that's what they were doing out in the parlor. And so I can remember vividly my grandfather lying in his casket in the parlor. And from that time on, that room always held a kind of a strange feeling for me. But it was a room that never was used much. I remember a Christmas tree in there. They put candles on the Christmas tree. Not having electricity, they obviously didn't. And even my little mind, I thought, man, that's a fire hazard, you know. But they would light the candles just for a few minutes and then blow them all out. And I remember asking my mom, are you sure they got them all out? Because we were staying in the room above. I wanted to make sure those Christmas candles were gone. But the wake lasted a couple of days, and people were in and out and all. But then he was buried in the family plot at their Baptist church. And my grandmother died a couple of years later and went through a similar process. But my parents didn't let us go to my grandfather's funeral. We stayed with a distant cousin, but we did go to my grandmother's funeral. And but funerals were even more simpler because not everybody's brother was a furniture slash undertaker. And most of the time it was in a wooden box, very simple. Very simple thing, because embalming was unheard of. Well, I guess it was in the urban areas of the country, but not in our section. It was just unheard of for embalming to take place. Entertainment was something that was fairly sparse. You entertained yourself. And my sister and I was talking with her recently. She married my brother-in-law, who was a retired professor at the University of Tennessee, and they've been over in Knoxville for many years. But we talked 2 or 3 times a week on the phone. And I was asking her the other day, I said, Dolly, one reason I remember her coming home to the hospital, they brought her in a basket, and I said, she looks like a little Dolly. And that became her name, much to her chagrin. She was Dolly, and still is to family, although Mary Louise is her real name. But we were just inseparable. We played together, we did everything together. And I asked her not too long ago, I said, Dolly, do you ever remember us having a harsh word between us? And she thought for a minute, and she said, well, you used to aggravate me and tease me sometime, and I would flare up for a minute, but I don't ever remember us having a real fuss or fight. And it's that way today. I mean, we're just as close today as we were growing up. And a real treat was in the afternoon, my grandmother would take out of the ice box a 6-ounce Coke. That's those little Cokes. And we would split a Coke. One would get the bottle today and the other would get a glass, and we'd reverse the next day. And I remember sitting on a table on the outside of the house enjoying our Cokes, and we'd make that Coke last for 30 minutes. I mean, just taking little sips. That was a real treat for us. And going to the movies was not a very frequent thing early on. One of my first movies I remember seeing was Gone with the Wind, and that came out in '38, I believe it was. And of course, I'd never seen Technicolor before. I'd only seen black and white. And when that came on, my mother went to see it to check it out. And so it's about a 4-hour movie. I noticed it on TV the other night. And she decided it was okay for us to go. There's one cuss word in it. And she decided it's okay for us. So we went, and when we got to the theater, it was full, and people waiting around the whole block to get in. And then all those folks would come out and they'd let a new group in. So we went in, and of course movies were very generally filled, but not that crowded. We went in to see Gone with the Wind. Well, I was just enthralled with it. And we sat there, and I looked over, and my mother had reached over and put both of her hands over my sister's ears, just as Rhett Butler said, "Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn." She let me hear it, but she didn't let my little sister. But I'm awful thankful that the library played such a significant part in our young life. We would go to the library, and of course we knew the librarians by name, and they knew us, and we'd check out as many books. She'd see that we got there once a week, and we'd check out as many books as they allowed, and we'd take those home. And we would read those books and take them back the next week and get some more. And so I used to sneak and watch and look at the National Geographics. You couldn't check them out, but they had ill-clad women, shall I say, from the third world countries and so forth. But nonetheless, my mama caught me one day over the National Geographic magazine section. She put that off limits for me for a while, but then we started subscribing. No, we didn't subscribe. The doctor she worked for subscribed to National Geographics, and the current edition would lay around his office for a month or two, and then as new ones came, my mother would bring the old ones home. But by then, I guess she thought I was old enough to digest the subject matter. But the library, thank the Lord, was available, and we were able to go there. And my mother is the only, I don't know how they afforded it, but my mom and dad bought a set of encyclopedias, and Compton's encyclopedias. It wasn't one of the great big ones, Americana or Britannica, but it was okay. And then each year they sent out a supplement. Well, I can remember my mother going to bed reading the encyclopedia. And she would read them through and then go to another volume. And I don't know if she read the whole set or not, but she instilled in my sister and me some great interest in reading, and we've always been big readers, and I still read 2.5 hours every night after I go to bed generally. And I have a stack of books by my bedside because I read 4 or 5 at a time, read on this one. But then, and I'm getting off the subject here, but one of the kids gave us a Kindle for Christmas. And so I just finished an intriguing biography of FDR during the World War II years. And I read the whole thing on the Kindle, but I didn't like it. I like the book. I want to turn to the page, and I want to see how much is left, and I want to thumb ahead a little bit and go back and read some. And you can do all of that on the Kindle, but I haven't mastered it yet, and I don't know that I will. Oh yeah, I will, because I mastered the computer, or to some extent anyway, things that I didn't think I would. But anyway, reading still remains a very important part of my continuing education. But I will have to say, I'm getting old, that someday I'll try to accumulate this knowledge, and someday I'm not going to be here, and all that knowledge is going to be gone. Did I waste my time? you know, doing that all those years. But anyway, I continued to plod on. All right, back to the subject, entertainment during the Depression. As I say, we entertained ourselves. I remember I must have been 3 or 4 years old when we got our first radio. And I can remember sitting around that thing just enthralled, creating all of these vivid imaginary images of what was going on. And I can remember in the late 30s listening to H.V. Caldenborn and other radio correspondents. And one night we were listening, and he was near the battle where Hitler invaded some country, and you could actually hear the guns in the distance. And that was all just fantastic to me. I mean, that man's talking to me from the other side of the world. But my first love was the Lone Ranger and some of the late afternoon shows. We'd be out playing, but at 5 o'clock we knew we'd come in. We'd miss the Lone Ranger. And so radio was a big source of entertainment. And one of the theaters in town, every weekend had a vaudeville show. And my mother would endeavor to take us to see live entertainment when she could. And so when we got a little older, they did it on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Nothing was open on Sunday. And we got old enough to where we'd meet her for lunch and then go down to the Broadway Theater for the vaudeville show. People pronounced it vaudeville. And but it was in the transition when vaudeville was going a little more risque, but it hadn't hit us yet until I'm going to tell this story. Maybe I shouldn't. But we went and we were able to go down there by ourselves, come back, meet my mom, and they'd also show a movie after the live show. Come back, meet my mom, we'd all ride the bus home. So we went one day, and my sister and I, we loved live entertainment, and 'cause we didn't see much of it. So one day we went down there, and we got on the bus, and we came home. My sister said, "I'm gonna see if I can do that." I said, "Do what?" There was a woman that could hang that in the show hung 2 tassels in a very graphic position, and she could twirl them in opposite directions. My mother came in and said, "Dolly, what are you doing?" "Oh, I'm trying to do what we saw in the show." And then she made us sit down and tell us the whole show. That was the last show we saw, because it had transmorphed from vaudeville into burlesque. And so we were never allowed to go back, much to my chagrin. I thought that one was pretty talented myself. So did my sister. But there were other things that we related to my mother as well. And oh, by the way, the woman was legally clad during her exposition. But anyway, we continued to go to movies, and they were nice. One of the old movies will come on once in a while now, and I'll look at it and remember that I saw that back in the mid 30s. And movies were no television, of course. Movies were phenomenal to our little mind. Well, to everybody's mind, that was quite a bit. But transportation, my grandfather, neither of my grandfathers ever learned to drive. And my maternal grandfather had a car, but he never drove it, and my uncle did. And so when the first car I remember us having was in the mid 30s, was an old brown Chevrolet, and it caught fire one day. And so my dad bought a brand new 1936 Chevrolet, and you had a choice between 4 doors and 2 doors. And my family never had a 4-door car until I was grown, because they didn't want us falling out the back. I fell out of a 2-door one time, but fortunately we were coming to a stop, and I was very anxious, and I jumped out, and the car was still rolling, but I wasn't injured. But anyway, that was the biggest luxury we'd ever had. Brand new car, cost $300. I think it's $333 or something. And we, of course, during World War II, they stopped making cars, so we was hung with that car. And my daddy finally, paint got so bad, he painted it with a paintbrush. But he sold that car in 1947 when we got another car. He sold that car for $600. And that's not what had happened to prices during those days. But anyway, we would take a trip about once a year to my grandfather and grandmother. Sometimes more often than that. We'd go in the wintertime one time, and then we'd go in the summertime. And later, my sister and my mom and I would ride the bus down there and stay a week or two at a time. And as I say, my mom was only 18 years older than I was. She was a beauty. I mean, that woman could have been a movie star. I mean, she was an absolute gorgeous lady. And we'd get on the bus, and then immediately somebody start flirting with her. And she had my sister and me along. They thought I was a little brother and sister, you know. And I remember telling them one time, "You leave my mama alone," and they did when they realized that I was her son. They didn't do anything overt. I mean, just kind of flirt a little bit. But anyway, we'd ride the bus down there, but we'd ride the car down there. And I don't remember many trips that we didn't have at least one flat tire. I mean, the tires were just no good back then. And you'd have a flat tire, and then the roads weren't as good either. And we'd have to get out and change the tire and then find a place to repair the spare. So didn't have those little teeny spares then, had a regular size spare. But trip, therefore, was always an adventure. We never knew what was going. My dad went down there one night, and they had a torrential rain. He went by himself to visit his mom and dad, and had a torrential rain, and the creek got up somewhere down around Spartanburg, and he couldn't get by. It came across the road. So he turned around to go back around somewhere. He turned around a mile or two, another creek behind him was up, and he was stuck between the two creeks. And so he had to wait till he spent the night there, waited till the next morning, and the creeks had gone back down. He went on down a day late, but he was there. But transportation was mostly around town, and at one point there, my dad had the only car in the extended family. So anybody wanted to go somewhere, I remember my grandmother would call on the phone and say, "Red, get your machine." That's what she called it. Said, "I need to go to the doctor." And my dad, of course, taxied everybody around. And my mother learned to drive. She did too. And in the country, of course, they had cars, but there was still an awful lot of horse and buggy traffic as well. And even in town, our ice was delivered each day to put a block of ice to put in our ice box to keep as best we could, and to have some ice for iced tea and so forth. And you'd hang a sign on the front door. It was a square sign. It would have 5, 10, 15, and 0 on each corner. And you would turn up the how many pounds you want. If you want 5 pounds, they'd bring you in a 5-pound cake and put it in the refrigerator in an ice box for you. And the ice truck was not a truck, it was a wagon drawn by a horse. And that was not an unusual thing even to see in town, was horse-drawn vehicles. And a lot of people come to town, on the weekend and they drive their buggies or wagons mostly. You didn't see all that many buggies, but they had wagons. And the wagon be loaded with kids, coming into town for the day, which was a big treat. But I never will forget the day we got an ice refrigerator. The milk, and the milk, of course, was delivered to your front door, and that was most often in a horse-drawn wagon as well. But the milk company, this was in the past the middle 30s. Depression was still heavy on the souls of everybody. But they had a deal that what you spent for ice, the milk company, what you spent for ice each week, they would put a refrigerator in, and they would, and you would pay what you spent for ice is sort of a rent-to-own thing. So finally, the refrigerator was a big addition to our family. And the ice cube business. Ice cubes, that was an absolute miracle to my eyes. That you could go in there and you'd have to chip off ice for your iced tea. You go in and get you an ice cube if you wanted it. And of course, by today's standards, it's a pain in the neck. But by our standards, that was a real luxury. And I remember the first day, we didn't have ice that first day, had to let it make overnight. I ran down the next day, pulled out ice, it was summertime, and I stuck my tongue on that ice tray and it stuck. I thought I would never get my tongue unhooked. It's reminiscent of that movie, Christmas Story, where the kid puts his tongue on a flagpole. Well, I was in that same, and my little 6-7-year-old tongue was hung. And my sister, of course, was laughing, and I finally, but my tongue was raw. But for several days after that, but I didn't make that mistake again. And but with the old refrigerator, old ice box, had 3 doors, one for the ice, one beneath that, and then a big one on the right. Well, they put it out back till they could decide how to get rid of it. Well, my sister and I would play in that old ice box, and we'd lock each other in there, and laugh and carry on. And only later did we start hearing about people suffocating, getting caught, because you couldn't open one from the inside. And but we did a lot of dangerous things. And the biggest entertainment that I had when I was about 7 years old, I got a BB gun for Christmas. And that was a dangerous thing, but nonetheless, that all boys got one pretty young. And all Christmas Day, I didn't get to play with it because my uncles were busy shooting it off my grandmother's back porch. And so finally I got to use my BB, and it went with me. Red Ryder BB. It went with me everywhere. As a matter of fact, I gave that BB to my youngest son a few years ago. I asked him if he still had it. He said he did. But anyway, I told you my sister and I, we were best buddies, and we got to hearing something about William Tell shooting the arrow off of the guy's head, And I thought that pretty neat. And so I said, Dolly, you want to try it? She said, yeah, she'd do anything her big brother would say. So I had an old tin Army helmet, the play helmet. So I put the helmet on her head, turned her back to me, and an apple on her head, and I shot the apple off her head. And so we put the apple back in on the fruit tray, and my mama came in, said, "What? They want to know how those holes got in that apple?" Because I did it more than once. And so my little sister spilled the beans. Well, that was the end of the BB gun for little John. And I didn't see that BB gun for more than a year, I guess. And then only then after some stern warnings and some stern rulings. But we just, like I say, my sister and I just played together. That was our entertainment. And then the neighborhood kids would all get together and play games and so forth. And then especially after supper, get out and play in the summertime. And there was a familiar call for parents to start calling the kids in. Well, 5 more minutes, Mama, 5 more minutes, and we'd stretch it out a few minutes. But when we came in, we didn't sit down and watch television. We were tired. We'd been busy playing all day. We went to sleep and got up the next morning and started all over again. But to be honest with you, those were kind and gentle days, and I miss them. And I don't want to go back to it now that I know what some affluence can bring and so forth. But I have very fond memories of that, and I'm sure some folks don't. But in my case, the Depression was something that we just weathered, and I do not ever remember hearing anybody complain. Now, that may be strange to your ears, but people just made do, and they helped each other. And then Franklin Roosevelt, I was born just a month or two before he was elected president, and then for years, my whole growing up years, I never knew another president. But he came in and immediately started the alphabet soup regime, I called it. He started all of these programs, and very few of them had any benefit to Southerners. Now, in the urban areas, I know it did. Now, in the South, in my mind and recollection, it amounted to a couple of things. One, there were a lot of new courthouses built, and there were a lot of public improvements made. And Blue Ridge Parkway was done under one of those programs. But the one that I remember having the most effect was the CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps, in which young boys, no girls, just young boys that I recall, were able to go into an Army camp type situation. And they were fed and clothed, taken care of medically, and given a few dollars a month that they could send back home. And I remember an awful lot of the older teenagers doing that in the various neighborhoods that we lived in. And that was a godsend to a lot of people. And then the Army became another outlet for Southern youth. Even before World War II, they would join the Army, and they were taken care of and paid $21 a month to boot. And but they didn't have many expenses, and so most were able to send some money back home to their parents and little brothers and sisters. But now the South's always been a militaristic society, and it's a known fact that a disproportionate share of Medal of Honor winners are from the southern states. And the War of 1812 would never have been fought if it hadn't been for Southern volunteers, because it was a lukewarm war anyway. And but the Southerners, they joined up right quick. And but anyway, the Franklin Roosevelt programs were cussed by many Southerners. They just thought they were printing money and doing stuff that was unnecessary. The alphabet programs, WPA and Writers Program and all of that, some of them were admirable, some of them served a real purpose, but the Southerners, for the most part, didn't partake of too many of the benefits. I don't want no charity. And when food stamps finally came to the South many years later, they had to run ads convincing people to take food stamps, because they don't have that trouble anymore. And as a result, we live in a very different society than we did during those days. But at the end of the 30s and the brink of World War II, some economic recovery started coming to the nation, and for the first time in generations to the South. And people moved around, they went into service, they went into defense plants all over the urban areas of the Southland as well as the North. Women went to work, and Rosie the Riveter came upon the scene, and we finally saw some relief from the economic depressed years. But in the process, some might think that we mutilated some other aspects of the American psyche. I happen to think they may be somewhat true.